In the last 2 episodes, we covered all the 8 dimensions of seeing. And all the 8 dimensions are captured in this one definition of seeing reality. Seeing reality is the movement of meeting external and internal objects with awareness within their broad context through direct perception, inference, or reliable understanding, resulting in painful, pleasant, or neutral experiences. The first of the 8 dimensions is meeting the object. Imagine you're walking through a garden, you see a rose. Almost instantly, the mind says rose, and then it moves on. But did you actually meet the rose, or did you simply recognize it? This may seem like a strange question. After all, if you know what something is, haven't you already seen it? Yet perhaps recognition and meeting are not the same thing. A child often looks differently at a rose. A child may stop, they may look closely, they may notice the shape, the color, the texture, the tiny drops of water on the petals. There is curiosity, there is contact, there is discovery. As adults, we often lose this. The mind becomes efficient, it labels quickly, classifies quickly, concludes quickly, and once the label arrives, attention often ends. The rose becomes a rose, the tree becomes a tree, the person becomes my spouse, the employee becomes an employee, and the politician becomes a politician. The mind feels it already knows, and perhaps that feeling of knowing is precisely what prevents deeper seeing. This episode explores a simple but profound question. What does it mean to actually meet something? Not merely recognize it, not merely name it, not merely fit into an existing category, but meet it. Because perhaps many of the difficulties in human relationships begin when we stop meeting what's in front of us and start meeting our ideas about it. We meet images, we meet memories, we meet expectations, we meet labels, and slowly the living reality disappears behind what we think we already know. Perhaps seeing begins with a different movement, a pause, a movement before recognition takes over, a moment in which object is allowed to be encountered freshly, a rose, a thought, an emotion, a spouse, a stranger, a human being. Perhaps the first step is simply learning how to meet. Now let's look at another example. This is about the sunrise at Kanyakumari. Imagine standing at Kanyakumari. For those who don't know, Kanyakumari is the southern tip of India where 3 bodies of water converge: the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Imagine standing at Kanyakumari before dawn. The sky is still dark, hundreds of people gather quietly near the shore. The sounds of waves fills the air. Slowly the horizon begins to brighten. Orange, pink, and gold finally. The sun rises from the ocean. For a brief moment, the entire sky seems alive, and yet something interesting often happens. Many people immediately reach for their phones, photos, videos, selfies, messages, posts. The experience becomes something to capture, something to store, something to share, something to, of course, remember later. But a question arises. While we are busy collecting the experience, are we actually meeting it? There is nothing wrong with taking a photograph. The photograph may become a beautiful memory. The problem begins when collecting replaces meeting. The mind becomes so occupied with preserving the moment, framing it, recording it, improving it, sharing it, and while all that is happening, the sunrise itself may be passing unnoticed. The eyes are present, the body is present, but attention has moved elsewhere. The object is no longer being met directly. Instead, the mind is occupied with what to do with the experience. Many moments in life are lived this way. A child performs in a school play, we record. A concert begins, we record. A beautiful view appears, and again we record. Sometimes we spend so much energy preserving the moment that we never fully enter it. Meeting requires a different movement. Nothing needs to be done. Nothing needs to be captured. Nothing needs to be improved. For a few moments, there is only the sunrise, the changing colors, the waves, the light, the vastness, the direct encounter. The mind is not collecting. Not comparing, not posting, not remembering, simply meeting. Perhaps this is why some experiences remain unforgettable, not because they were photographed, but because they were fully met. And perhaps the question extends far beyond a sunrise. How much of life are we collecting, and how much of life are we actually meeting? At this point, someone might object. A sunrise is extraordinary. Of course, it captures our attention. Of course, it invites observation. But what about ordinary objects? What about things we encounter every day? A pencil, a cup, a chair, a leaf lying on the ground. Can the meeting occur there as well? Or is meeting reserved only for the beautiful, the unusual, and the dramatic? The answer becomes clearer when we look at something as simple as a pencil. Most of us can identify a pencil instantly. The moment it appears, recognition takes place. That's a pencil. And because the object has been recognized, the mind often feels the task is complete. Recognition occurs, perception ends. The object disappears beneath the label. But what would happen if we stayed with it for a few more moments? Not analyzing it, not thinking about it, simply meeting it. Perhaps for the first time, we begin noticing details that were always present. The texture of the wood, the sharpness of the tip, the faint marks left by a previous use of it, the weight of it in the hand, the smell of the wood, the way light reflects from its surface. Suddenly, something interesting happens. The pencil becomes alive again, not because the pencil changed, but because attention changed. Ordinarily, familiarity creates a strange blindness. The more often we encounter something, the less we actually see it. Our spouse, our home, our neighborhood, our daily routine, even our thoughts. The mind says, I already know this, and because it believes it knows, it stops looking. The label becomes a substitute for perception. A pencil becomes just a pencil. A tree becomes just a tree. Even a person becomes just my co-worker. The ordinary becomes invisible, yet reality is always encountered in the ordinary. Life is not occupied only by dramatic moments. Most of life consists of common moments, common objects, common people, common experiences. If we cannot meet the ordinary, we will spend much of our lives moving through reality without truly encountering it. The challenge is not learning how to meet extraordinary things. Almost everyone pauses for a beautiful sunset. Almost everyone notices a breathtaking mountain. The deeper challenge is meeting what has become familiar. Can we meet the pencil? Can we meet the tree we walk past every day? Can we meet the person we think we already know? Because perhaps the greatest obstacle to seeing is not ignorance. It is the feeling that we already know. And perhaps the beginning of meeting is the willingness to look again, not because the object has changed, but because we have stopped assuming we have fully seen it. Meeting is not merely a philosophical exercise, nor is it limited to moments of beauty or curiosity. Sometimes meeting has practical consequences. Sometimes it allows us to notice something that would otherwise be missed. Consider a simple experience from everyday life. One morning, I opened the sliding door to the backyard for my dog, as I had done countless times before. A few moments later, I sat down and looked at her. At first, I simply saw my dog. The familiar recognition appeared instantly, my dog. Normally, that would have been the end of perception, but for some reason, I continued looking. As I stayed with the observation, new details began appearing. Her skin looked puffy. There were bumps I had not noticed before. Something seemed different. The longer I looked, the more became visible. Eventually, I realized she was having an allergic reaction. What is interesting is that the signs had been there from the beginning. The puffiness was there, the bumps were there, the symptoms were there. What changed was not the dog. What changed was the quality of observation. Recognition gave me my dog. Meeting revealed my dog is suffering. Perhaps this is one reason meeting matters. The label is often correct, but reality is usually richer than the label. And sometimes what we fail to see is not hidden. We simply stop looking too soon. The experience with my dog illustrates something important. Meeting is not merely about noticing more details. It is not simply a way of becoming more attentive. Sometimes meeting changes what becomes possible. Had I relied only on recognition, I might have seen only my dog. Because I continued looking, something new was revealed. The allergic reaction became visible. The response that followed was different because the seeing was different. This points towards another aspect of meeting that is often overlooked, its relationship to creativity. When we immediately recognize an object, we tend to respond from what we already know. When we truly meet an object, something new has the opportunity to emerge. Perhaps creativity begins here. Many people think creativity begins with imagination. Often it begins with observation. The deeper we meet an object, the more it reveals. The artist discovers details others overlook. The scientist discovers patterns others miss. The inventor discovers possibilities hidden in plain sight. The writer discovers stories inside ordinary moments. Recognition says, I already know. Meeting says, let me look again. And perhaps creativity lives in that second movement. Because the movement we believe we already know, discovery ends. The moment we meet something freshly, creativity begins. Up to this point, we have explored meeting through a sunrise, a pencil, a dog, and the role of creativity. Yet there is one object we encounter more frequently than almost any other, the human being. And perhaps no object is more difficult to meet. A pencil does not insult us. A sunrise does not disappoint us. A dog does not challenge our beliefs. Human beings do. The moment we encounter another person, memories arise, past experiences, judgments, labels, expectations, stories. Before long, we may no longer be meeting the person. We may be meeting our idea of the person. The spouse becomes the one who never listens. The colleague becomes the difficult one. The manager becomes the problem. The customer becomes the complaint. The politician becomes one of them. The human being slowly disappears behind the conclusions we have formed. And yet, if meeting has value with a pencil, a sunrise, or a dog, perhaps it has even greater value here. For the quality of our relationships may depend, in part, on whether we continue meeting the person before us or merely the image we carry of them. And now we're on to the most important object, the human being. Meeting a rose may be difficult. Meeting a human being is often far more difficult because with a rose there's usually little at stake. With people, the mind carries history, memory, judgment, expectation, fear, desire, and even comparison. The moment we encounter another person, labels often arrive almost instantly. Friend, stranger, customer, employee, manager, Republican, Democrat, rich, poor, educated, uneducated, attractive, unattractive, successful, and of course, unsuccessful. The label appears, and once the label appears, the mind begins relating to the label rather than the person. A stranger walks into the room, and before they have spoken a single word, the mind may already be forming conclusions. Their clothing, their accent, their age, their race, their profession, their appearance, all become pieces from which a story is constructed, and yet none of these things are the person. They may tell us something about the person, but they are not the person. A label can be useful. Human beings cannot function without labels. We need names, roles, categories, descriptions. The problem begins when the label replaces the human being. A parent stops seeing a child and sees only grades. A manager stops seeing a person and sees only performance. A voter stops seeing a human being and sees only a political position. A customer stops seeing a worker and sees only a service. A spouse stops seeing a partner and sees only a collection of past memories. The person slowly disappears behind the image. And what remains is a relationship between images. One image meeting another image. One story meeting another story. One conclusion meeting another conclusion. The human being is no longer being met directly. Consider how often this happens in daily life. You meet someone at a party and within minutes, questions begin. What do they do? Where are they from? What school did they attend? How much do they earn? The mind searches for categories, for a place to put the person, for a way to understand them quickly. Yet perhaps understanding another human being is not a matter of categorizing them. Perhaps it begins with meeting them, not as a role, not as a profession, even not as a collection of opinions, but as a living human being, a conscious being, someone who, like you, has known joy, known fear, known disappointments, known hope, known uncertainty, known loss. The details may differ, the stories may differ, but the humanity is shared. Meeting a human being does not mean abandoning intelligence. It does not mean ignoring facts. It does not mean pretending differences do not exist. Differences definitely do exist. Roles exist. Histories exist. But beneath all of them stands a human being. And perhaps one of the deepest forms of seeing is the ability to hold both at the same time, to recognize the role, yet still meet the person, to acknowledge the label, yet not mistake it for the whole, to see the differences, yet not lose sight of the shared humanity between them. Because perhaps the greatest tragedy is not that we disagree with one another, it is that we stop seeing one another. And perhaps the beginning of humanity is simply to meet a human as a human. The importance of meeting another human being becomes especially visible in relationships. Not only personal relationships, professional relationships as well. Everyday managers evaluate employees. Employees evaluate managers. Performance reviews are conducted. Targets are discussed. Promotions are awarded. Corrections are made. And difficult conversations take place. In all these situations, there is a risk that the human being disappears behind the role. The employee becomes a performance rating. The manager becomes a title. The person becomes a function. Yet behind every role is a human being with fears, hopes, struggles, ambitions, and circumstances that may not be immediately visible. Meeting becomes difficult because roles are useful. Organizations depend on them. But when the role completely replaces the person, something important is lost. A workplace may remain efficient, yet understanding begins to diminish. The relationship between a manager and an employee provides a useful example. One of the easiest places to stop meeting a human being is in the workplace. Organizations are built around performance, targets, deadlines, budgets, productivity, deliverables, and of course, appraisals. These things matter. Without them, organizations cannot function. But there is a subtle danger. The employee can gradually disappear behind the metrics. A manager begins with responsibility. They must ensure work is completed, goals are met, customers are served, projects move forward. Naturally, attention becomes focused on performance. Who is delivering, who is struggling, who is meeting expectations, who is falling behind. Over time, something interesting can happen. The employee is no longer seen primarily as a human being. They become a performance profile, a productivity rating, a resource, a role, a position on an organizational chart. The person slowly disappears behind the function. John notices that one of his employees, Sarah, has missed several deadlines. Immediately, conclusions began forming. She is disengaged. She lacks commitment. She is not performing. These conclusions may eventually prove correct. But have they been seen or inferred? The manager sees the missing deadlines. The rest is often a story built around them. A manager who is meeting only performance sees one reality. A manager who is meeting the person sees a broader one. Perhaps Sarah's parent has become ill. Perhaps she is struggling with anxiety. Perhaps she is overwhelmed by responsibilities outside of work. Perhaps she's burned out after months of carrying more than anyone realized. The missed deadline remains real. The performance issues remain real. Meeting the person does not mean ignoring reality. It means seeing more of it. A manager who sees only performance often reaches quickly for judgment. A manager who meets the person becomes curious. What is happening? What am I not seeing? What might explain this? These questions do not weaken accountability. They encourage understanding. Consider another situation. A manager receives a message from one of their strongest employees. The employee needs to take several weeks off. A family tragedy has occurred. A manager focused only on performance immediately sees the disruption, the deadline, the staffing gap, the delayed project, the lost productivity. Everything is viewed through the impact on the organization. A manager who has met the employee sees something else as well. The deadlines remain real, the staffing challenges remain real, but now consider another reality is present. A human being is suffering, a family has been affected, a life has been disrupted. The employee is no longer merely a performer who is temporarily unavailable. They are a human being experiencing loss. The practical problems still need solutions. Work still needs to continue. Projects still need to move forward. But the quality of the response changes. Compassion enters. Patience enters. Understanding enters. The manager begins asking different questions. What support do they need? How can we help? What is the most humane response here? The facts have not changed. The absence remains. The deadlines remain. The workload remains. What changes is the seeing. Meeting the employee does not remove responsibility. It changes the spirit in which responsibility is carried. This is why meeting matters. It does not replace performance. It places performance within a larger reality. The target and the person, the deadline and the person, the appraisal and the person, and of course the performance and the person. When this happens, leadership changes, conversations begin, trust changes, even accountability changes, because accountability no longer arises merely from managing performance. It arises from understanding the human being behind it. Perhaps one of the deepest responsibilities of leadership is not simply managing work. It is remembering that every metric, every deadline, every appraisal, and every target is concerned to a human being. And perhaps seeing begins when the person is no longer hidden behind the performance. The challenge of meeting another human being is not limited to the workplace. In fact, it may become even more difficult in our closest relationships. A manager and an employee may spend only a few hours a week together. Life partners may spend years, decades, thousands of conversations, countless shared experiences, and yet paradoxically, familiarity does not always lead to deeper meeting. Sometimes it produces the opposite. The more we know about someone, the easier it becomes to stop looking. Memories accumulate, stories accumulate, expectations accumulate. Gradually an image forms, who they are, what they will say, how they will react, what they like, what they dislike, what they always do. Before long, we may find ourselves relating not to the living person before us, but to the image we have built over years of experience. The image becomes familiar, predictable, comfortable, yet the human being continues to change, continues to grow, continues to struggle, and of course continues to surprise. Meeting becomes difficult because we feel we already know. Perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the relationship between life partners. When two people first meet, there is often curiosity, attention, discovery. Each person is still largely unknown. There is a sense of meeting, a sense of learning, a sense of seeing. But as the years pass, something begins to accumulate. Memories, experiences, arguments, disappointments, pleasures, expectations, stories. Gradually, an image is formed. The image is not merely false. It is built from real experiences, but it is still an image, a mental representation of the other person. And one day, without realizing it, we may discover that we are no longer meeting our partner. We are meeting our image of them. The spouse speaks. Before the sentence is finished, the mind says, I know where this is going. I've heard this before. That's just how they are. The image has arrived before the person. A small disagreement occurs, yet the disagreement is no longer only about the present moment. It carries years of accumulated history. Past arguments appear, old hurts appear, unresolved disappointments appear. The current event becomes merged with everything that came before it. The partner standing in front of us is no longer being met freshly. They are being viewed through a lens built over years. Sometimes the image is positive. My spouse is always supportive. My spouse is wonderful. Even positive images can interfere with meeting because an image, whether favorable or unfavorable, is still not the living person. The person continues changing, learning, growing, struggling, evolving, yet the image often remains frozen. A conclusion reached years ago may continue shaping perception long after reality has changed. Perhaps the greatest challenge in intimate relationships is that familiarity creates the illusion of complete knowledge. We believe we know the other person. After all, we have lived together for years. Shared experiences, shared struggles, shared memories. But do we really know them? Or do we know our accumulated image of them? The person standing before us today is not exactly the same person we met 10 years ago, nor are we. New experiences have shaped them, new fears, new hopes, new insights, new wounds, new strengths. Life continues moving. Yet perception often remains fixed. The image says, I already know who you are. Meeting says, let me look again. This does not mean forgetting the past. The past exists, memories exist, patterns exist, trust exists. Of course, betrayal also exists. All of these are real. Meeting does not require pretending history never happened. It requires recognizing when history becomes the only thing we can see. Sometimes a partner says something kind, yet the mind hears it through years of previous hurt. Sometimes a partner has changed, yet the image refuses to update. Sometimes a relationship suffers not because love is absent, but because the image has become stronger than perception. The tragedy is subtle. Two people may live together for decades, yet relate primarily through images. One image speaking to another image, one set of expectations meeting another set of expectations. Meanwhile, the living human beings remain partially unseen. Perhaps this is why relationships can sometimes feel stale or disconnected, not because the person disappeared, but because the meeting disappeared. To meet a life partner again is not necessarily a grand event. It may begin with something very small, a pause, a moment of attention, a willingness to notice when the image arrives, a willingness to ask, am I meeting the person? Or am I meeting my memory of the person? In that moment, something fresh becomes possible. The familiar becomes alive again. Curiosity returns. Attention returns. The relationship becomes less about managing an image and more about meeting a living human being. And perhaps one of the deepest forms of love is not found in memory, nor in expectation, nor in possession. Perhaps it is found in the simple ability to meet the other person again and again as they are, rather than as we have concluded them to be. Even when we encounter something for the first time, meeting does not always occur. Familiarity is one obstacle, judgment is another. The moment an object appears, the mind often begins evaluating it. Beautiful, ugly, pleasant, unpleasant, attractive, unattractive, good, bad. The judgment may arrive so quickly that we hardly notice it, and once it appears, attention often shifts away from the object itself. The judgment becomes more prominent than what is being judged. A flower appears beautiful, a building appears ugly, a painting appears wonderful, a face appears unattractive. The evaluation may feel like seeing, yet it is possible that the judgment arrives before the meeting is complete. The object is still being encountered, yet the mind has already reached a conclusion. This is not to suggest that beauty and ugliness do not exist, nor that we should suppress our reactions. The question is simply whether the judgment ends the meeting, whether the label becomes a substitute for further observation. For once we decide that something is beautiful or ugly, there is often a temptation to stop looking. One of the fastest movements of the mind is judgment. We see something, almost instantly a verdict appears. Beautiful, ugly, attractive, unattractive, good, bad, like, dislike. The speed is remarkable. Often the judgment arrives so quickly that we never notice the gap between seeing and evaluating. A person enters the room. Before they have spoken a single word, impressions begin forming. Attractive, not attractive, interesting, uninteresting, stylish, unstylish. The evaluation appears almost automatically. The same thing happens with places, objects, food, art, ideas. The mind constantly sorts reality into categories of preference and aversion. The movement is so common that it often feels like seeing itself. Yet judgment and seeing are not the same thing. Seeing encounters the object, judgment evaluates it. The distinction may seem small, but its consequences are enormous. Imagine standing before a rose. For a brief moment, there is only the rose. Then the mind says, beautiful. Nothing seems wrong with this. After all, the rose may indeed appear beautiful, but something subtle has happened. Attention has shifted. The focus is no longer entirely on the rose. It is now on the relationship between the rose and the observer. The judgment reveals something about the observer's experience, not only about the object. The same rose that appears beautiful to one person may evoke sadness in another, indifference in the third. The judgment tells us as much about the mind meeting the object as it does about the object itself. Attraction creates a similar movement. A person appears, the mind says beautiful, interest arises, desire arises, fantasy may begin. Soon the person is no longer being met directly. The mind becomes occupied with its reaction to the person. The evaluation gradually replaces the encounter. Aversion works in exactly the same way. Someone appears, the mind says unpleasant, arrogant, unattractive. Dislike appears, resistance appears, distance appears. Again, the person is no longer being met. The judgment stands between the observer and the observed. What is remarkable is how little information is often required. A face, an accent, a style of clothing, a political opinion, a profession. Within seconds, the mind may construct an entire impression, and once the judgment forms, perception often narrows. Evidence supporting the judgment is noticed. Evidence contradicting it is overlooked. The verdict begins guiding perception. This does not mean all evaluations are wrong. Human beings naturally evaluate. Discernment has value. Recognizing danger has value. Making choices has value. The issue is not that judgment occurs. The issue is forgetting that they are judgments. A thought appears, a conclusion appears, and the mind mistakes the conclusion for reality itself. Meeting requires something different. Not the absence of judgment, but awareness of judgment, the ability to notice. Beautiful has appeared, ugly has appeared, like has appeared, dislike has appeared. The judgment is seen, yet it is not allowed to completely replace the object. For a brief moment, the mind steps back and the object is encountered again. Perhaps this is why genuine seeing feels fresh. It is not imprisoned by immediate conclusions. It remains open, curious, interested, alive. A child often looks this way. A child may spend several minutes studying an insect, a leaf, or a stone, not because they have concluded something important about it, but because they are meeting it. The adult mind often rushes to evaluation. The child's mind often remains in contact. Perhaps seeing begins when we notice the speed with which judgment appears, and perhaps meeting becomes possible when we allow a little space between the object and the verdict. In that space, the object has a chance to reveal itself, and in that space, we may discover that reality is often richer than our first judgment of it. Judgment does not always end with a simple evaluation. Sometimes it goes further. Sometimes the object is reduced to a single aspect of itself. A person becomes a role, a body, a function, a category, a source of pleasure, a source of profit, a source of labor, a source of votes, a source of approval. The richness of the whole gradually gives way to a single dimension. This process is often called objectification. Objectification does not necessarily mean treating someone badly, nor does it require hostility. In many cases, it occurs quietly and unintentionally. The customer becomes a transaction. The employee becomes productivity. The voter becomes a statistic. The audience becomes engagement. The life partner becomes a source of comfort, security, or validation. Something important is lost: the human being. A distance begins to appear between one person and another. Not a physical distance, a perceptual distance. The other is no longer encountered in their fullness. Only a fragment is being met. And once a fragment replaces the whole, understanding begins to diminish. Meeting becomes difficult because the person is no longer being encountered as a person. They are being encountered as an object. To understand why this matters, we must look more closely at what happens when a human being is reduced to a single aspect of themselves. Objectification is the reduction of a human being to a thing, attribute, function, role, or use, while neglecting their full humanity. Objectification occurs when a person is no longer encountered as a complete human being. Instead, they're reduced to a function, a role, a benefit, a use, something they can provide. At first, this may sound extreme, yet objectification is often far more common than we realize. A customer becomes a source of revenue. An employee becomes a resource. A voter becomes a vote. A service worker becomes a service. A student becomes a grade. A teacher becomes a credential. A spouse becomes a source of comfort. A friend becomes a source of support. In each case, something important is lost. The human being behind the role begins to disappear. The relationship becomes organized around utility. What can the person do for me? What can I get from them? How do they fit into my needs? The person is no longer primary. The function is. This does not mean functions are unimportant. The customer does purchase a product. The employee does perform work. The teacher, of course, does teach. And the doctor does provide care. Roles exist, functions exist. The problem begins when the role becomes the whole person. A waiter is not merely a waiter. A manager is not merely a manager. A customer is not merely a customer. And a spouse is not merely a spouse. Each role points to a human being. Yet the mind often stops at the role. When this happens, something subtle changes. A distance appears between one and another. The customer becomes the customer, the employee becomes the employee, the voter becomes the voter, the stranger becomes a stranger. The relationship becomes less personal, less human, less immediate. The person is no longer being met directly. Instead, they are encountered through a category, a role, or a function, and the distance has consequences. It is easier to cheat a customer when the customer is seen only as a source of revenue. It is easier to overlook an employee when the employee is seen only as a resource. It's easier to manipulate a voter when the voter is only seen as a vote. It's easier to ignore a service worker when the worker is seen only as a function. Why? Because empathy naturally weakens when the person disappears. The more completely we meet another human being, the harder it becomes to use them merely as a means to an end. The more completely we reduce them to a function, the easier it becomes to justify behavior that we might otherwise question. Objectification does not merely change perception, it changes relationship, and relationship often changes action. The reduction can become even stronger when desire enters. A person is seen primarily through attraction, through what pleasure they might provide, through what status they might offer, through what need they might satisfy. The richer reality of the person begins to disappear behind the desire. The mind becomes occupied with what it wants, and what it wants gradually replaces what is actually there. Objectification can also occur through aversion. A person becomes the difficult customer, the annoying co-worker, the opposition, the competitor. The label narrows perception. The category replaces the human being. Whether through attraction or aversion, the movement is remarkably similar. The other person is reduced, simplified, flattened, made smaller than they really are. What makes objectification so common is that it is efficient. Human beings are complex. Meeting another person fully requires attention, patience, curiosity, listening. The mind often prefers shortcuts. A label is easier than a human being. A stereotype is easier than a human being. A role is easier than a human being. An image is easier than a human being, but convenience comes at a cost. The cost is relationship. The cost is understanding. The cost is humanity. Meeting moves in a different direction. Meeting asks, who is this person? Not what can they do for me? Not what category do they belong to? Not how do they fit into my plans? But who are they? A living human being with fears, hopes, dreams, confusion, joy, pain. A life as real to them as yours is to you. The opposite of objectification is not admiration. It is not affection. It is not agreement. The opposite of objectification is meeting. The willingness to encounter another person without immediately reducing them to their usefulness, attractiveness, status, role, or label. Perhaps every act of genuine respect begins there. Not with approval, not with agreement, but with simple willingness to meet another human as a human. Objectification can take many forms. A person may be reduced to a role, a function, a label, a category, or even a single physical attribute. One of the most powerful forces affecting our ability to meet an object is desire. A person walks into a room. For a brief moment, there is simply perception. Then attraction appears, interest appears, desire appears. At first, this seems like a deeper form of seeing. After all, attention becomes highly focused. The person appears vivid, important, captivating, yet something subtle has happened. The attention is no longer evenly distributed. It begins gathering around what is attractive, what is pleasurable, what is desirable. The attractive aspect starts becoming the whole. Consider a Porsche parked on the street. Someone walks past it and immediately feels desire. The shape, the color, the power, the beauty, the image is compelling. But what is being seen? The monthly payments are not being seen. The insurance costs are not being seen. The maintenance is not being seen. The depreciation is not being seen. The impact on the household budget is not being seen. The trade-offs are not being seen. The postponed vacation is not being seen. The effect on a child's education fund is not being seen. The additional financial stress is not being seen. The object has not been met in its entirety. One aspect has become dominant. The attractive aspect has eclipsed the rest. Desire often works this way. It narrows the field of perception. What supports the desire becomes vivid. What challenges the desire fades into the background. Monthly payments are not being seen. The insurance costs are not being seen. The maintenance is not being seen. The depreciation is not being seen. The practical inconveniences are not being seen. The object has not been met in its entirety. The same movement often appears in relationships. A person appears attractive. Attention gathers around the qualities that genuinely attract the person. Beauty, charm, confidence, intelligence, humor. The attractive aspects become highly illuminated. Everything else becomes secondary. For a time, the person may appear almost perfect, not because they are perfect, but because perception has become selective. The mind is no longer seeing the whole, it is seeing what supposed desire. That is why attraction can sometimes create idealization. The attractive person becomes an image, a fantasy, a projection. Qualities are added, possibilities are imagined, stories are created. Meanwhile, the actual human being remains only partially seen. Then time passes. The field widens. The whole person begins appearing. Strengths become visible. Weaknesses become visible. Habits become visible. Fears become visible. Insecurities become visible. And humanity becomes visible. Often, this is the moment people say, they changed. But frequently, the person did not change nearly as much as perception did. The field simply widened. More of reality became visible. Meeting requires this widening, not the suppression of attraction, not the denial of desire. Attraction is natural. Desire is natural. The issue is not whether attraction appears. The issue is whether attraction becomes the whole lens through which the object is viewed. Can attraction exist without replacing perception? Can desire exist without narrowing the field completely? Can we appreciate what is attractive while remaining open to the larger reality? These questions are not limited to romantic relationships. The same movement appears everywhere. A new car, a new job, a new house, a new opportunity, a new investment, a new idea. Desire highlights certain aspects and hides others. The attractive parts move to the foreground. The rest recedes into the background. Meeting restores the whole, the costs and the benefits, the strengths and the weaknesses, the beauty and the imperfections, the pleasure and the difficulties, the image and the reality. Perhaps this is one reason genuine seeing is so different from desire. Desire narrows, meeting widens. Desire selects, meeting includes. Desire is drawn to the part, meeting remains open to the whole. And perhaps one of the deepest forms of perception begins when we recognize the narrowing influence of attraction and allow the whole object to come into view. For it is only when the whole is visible that the object can truly be met. If objectification reduces a person to a function and desire reduces a person to an attractive fragment, dehumanization reduces a person to a label. A human being appears almost immediately, a category appears. Race, caste, religion, nationality, political affiliation, gender, occupation, social class, and the list goes on. The label arrives, and slowly the human being begins to disappear behind it. The mind no longer encounters a living person. It encounters a category, the immigrant, the conservative, the liberal, the Hindu, the Muslim, the rich, the poor, the upper caste, the lower caste. The category becomes the primary reality. The human being becomes secondary. At first, this seems harmless. Human beings naturally use categories. Categories help us navigate a complex world. The problem begins when the category becomes the person. Because no human being is fully contained within a label. A label may describe one aspect of a person, but it can never describe the whole. Yet the mind often behaves as though it can. A person speaks with an accent, conclusions appear. A person belongs to a religion, conclusions appear. A person belongs to a caste, conclusions appear. A person supports a political party, conclusions appear. The observation may be real, the conclusions are added. Soon the conclusions become stories. The stories become certainty, and certainty replaces the meeting. This process has appeared throughout human history. In some societies, skin color becomes the label. People observed race. Then stories were attached. Stories about intelligence, capability, character, worth. In other societies, caste played a similar role. In others, religion. In others, nationality. The labels changed. the psychological movement remained remarkably similar. The mind saw one aspect of a person and allowed that aspect to become the whole. The category expanded. The human being contracted. That is why prejudice often feels obvious to the person holding it. The grooves have become deep. The stories have been repeated. The conclusions have become familiar. The observer no longer experiences them as conclusions. They experience them as reality. Yet, if we look carefully, something remarkable becomes visible. Every label hides as much as it reveals. A label may tell us where someone was born, but not what they fear. A label may tell us their religion, but not what they love. A label may tell us their politics, but not what they have suffered. A label may tell us their occupation, but not what they dream about at night. The label reveals one thing: the human being contains thousands. Meeting begins when we remember this. Not by denying differences. Differences exist. Cultures exist. Beliefs exist. Histories exist. Meeting does not require pretending otherwise. Meeting requires something simpler: the willingness to continue looking after the label appears, to see the race and the person, the caste and the person, the religion and the person, the nationality and the person, the political position and the person. For behind every label stands a human being, someone who has known joy, known fear, known disappointment, known hope, known uncertainty, known loss, just as we have. Perhaps this is why dehumanization is so dangerous. It does not merely distort thought, it interrupts meeting. And when meeting disappears, humanity often disappears with it. Perhaps the beginning of humanity is not agreement, nor approval, nor shared belief. Perhaps it begins with something much simpler: the refusal to allow a label to become the whole person, the willingness to continue looking, and in continuing to look, allowing the human being to reappear. Throughout this episode, we have explored the meeting of external objects: a rose, a sunrise, a pencil, a human being. But not all objects appear outside of us. Some of the most important objects we will ever encounter arise within the mind itself. A thought appears, a feeling appears, a memory appears, an emotion appears. Fear, anger, jealousy, excitement, sadness, hurt, desire. These too can become objects of observation. Yet something, an inner object, is often more difficult than meeting an outer one. When a rose appears, we can see the rose. When anger appears, we can often become the anger. When fear appears, we often become the fear. When jealousy appears, we often become the jealousy. The distance that exists between observer and object seems to disappear. The experience takes over. A comment is made, anger appears. Almost immediately, attention shifts away from the anger itself and towards its explanation. They shouldn't have said that. They were disrespectful. They always do this. The stories multiply. The anger remains largely unexamined. The same thing happens with fear. Fear appears. The mind immediately begins solving, escaping, planning, preparing. Very little attention is given to the fear itself. The object is present, but it is not being met. Most human beings spend years reacting to emotions. Far fewer spend time observing them. Meeting introduces a different possibility. The anger appears, and instead of immediately following it, there is a pause. The fear appears, and instead of immediately escaping it, there is a pause. The jealousy appears, and instead of immediately justifying it, there is a pause. For years, the first time the object itself is encountered, what does anger actually feel like? How does fear move through the body? What happens when jealousy appears? How does hurt unfold? These questions cannot be answered through theory. They can only be answered through meeting. Many people attempt to change emotion they have never fully met. They try to eliminate fear, control anger, suppress jealousy, escape sadness. Yet Understanding rarely comes through avoidance. Understanding begins with observation. A scientist first observes, a doctor first examines, a gardener first looks. Perhaps inwardly the same principle applies. Before changing, observe. Before correcting, observe. And definitely before escaping, observe. The observation itself begins revealing things that explanation could not. Patterns became visible, attachments became visible, conditioning became visible, the movement of the self became visible. An emotion that once seemed mysterious begins revealing its structure. The observer begins seeing not only the emotion but also the stories attached to it, the fear and the thoughts about the fear, the anger and the justification around the anger, the hurt and the narrative built around the hurt. The object and additions became distinguishable. Meeting does not end when the object is encountered. In many ways, it begins there. Every object we meet has the potential to affect us. A sunrise may inspire us, a rose may delight us, a piece of music may move us, a criticism may sting, a compliment may please us, a delayed reply may create anxiety, and a forgotten thank you may create disappointment. The object disappears and something within us responds. This response is part of the meeting. The object is not merely observed from a distance. It touches us. It leaves an impression. It awakens memories. It stirs emotions. It triggers expectations. And of course, it activates hopes and fears. Two people may encounter the same object and experience very different impacts. One person receives criticism and becomes defensive. Another receives the same criticism and becomes thoughtful. One person encounters a challenge and feels excitement. Another encounters the same challenge and feels fear. The object may be the same, the impact is not. This is because the meeting does not occur between the object alone and the senses. It occurs between the object and the whole of the person encountering it, their experiences, their conditioning, their memories, their desires, their fears, and their expectations. All participate in the meeting. This is one reason meeting is so revealing. The object often shows us something about ourselves. A harsh comment may reveal a hidden insecurity. A compliment may reveal a desire for recognition. A delay may reveal impatience. A disagreement may reveal attachment to being right. The object appears and something within us becomes visible. The forgotten thank you, the delayed reply, the criticism, the praise, the rejection, the recognition, each leaves its mark. Each creates an impact. Each reveals something about the relationship between the object and the self. Perhaps this is why everyday life provides endless opportunities for learning. The world continually presents us with objects, people, events, situations, challenges, opportunities, and each meeting carries the possibility of discovery. Not only discovery about the object, but discovery about ourselves. Meeting, therefore, is not merely a way of knowing the world, it is also a way of knowing oneself. The object is encountered, the impact is felt, and through that impact, something hidden may be revealed. A criticism may reveal insecurity. A compliment may reveal a desire for recognition. A delay may reveal impatience. A disagreement may reveal attachment. The world continually offers such opportunities, not only to meet what happens, but to discover with those encounters what it reveals about ourselves. In many traditions, this process is known as self-study or swadhyaya, the study of one's own mind, one's own reactions, one's own conditioning. We have briefly touched upon it here, but we will explore it more deeply in a future episode. Before self-study can occur, however, something else is required. The reaction itself must first become visible. This brings us to the next dimension of seeing, awareness. Now let us explore why fresh meeting becomes very difficult. Imagine a muddy road after many bullock carts have passed through it. Over time, deep grooves form in the earth. Now another cart approaches. As the wheels enter the grooves, very little effort is required to navigate it through the road. The direction has already been established. The path has already been chosen. The wheels naturally follow the tracks left behind by countless carts before them. The human mind often works in a similar way. When an object appears, perception rarely begins from a completely fresh encounter. Instead, the mind tends to fall into existing grooves. Old memories, old labels, old judgments, old conclusions, old conditioning. The object appears, the wheels drop into the track, and the familiar response begins. A spouse speaks, the mind follows old conclusions. A colleague makes a comment, the mind follows old judgments. A political opinion appears, the mind follows old beliefs. A person from a particular caste, religion, nationality, or profession appears, the mind follows familiar stories. The movement feels natural, effortless, obvious, yet what is being followed may not be the object itself, it may simply be the groove. This is one reason why meeting is so difficult. The challenge is not that reality is hidden, the challenge is that the mind often feels it already knows. The tracks have become deep through years of repetition. Each encounter strengthens them. Each conclusion deepens them. Each unquestioned assumption reinforces them. Over time, something else begins to happen. Freshness starts to fade. The tree becomes just a tree. The sunrise becomes just another sunrise. The spouse becomes the same person I've known for years. The colleague becomes the difficult one. The world becomes increasingly familiar, not because reality has become less rich, but because perception has become more rigid. A young child often meets the world differently. A leaf, an insect, a puddle, a stranger. Everything seems worthy of attention. Everything invites curiosity. Everything is being encountered. As the grooves deepen, the feeling of "I already know" becomes more common. Recognition gradually replaces meeting. The world becomes smaller not because reality has shrunk, but because perception has stopped exploring it. Meeting requires a different movement, not the movement of following the track, the movement of looking again, the movement of questioning the familiar conclusion, the movement of allowing the object to reveal something new. The spouse may not be exactly who yesterday's memory says they are. The colleague may not be exactly who last year's judgment says they are. The tree may contain details that have never been noticed. The sunrise may still have something to reveal. Fresh perception does not necessarily erase the old grooves. Years of conditioning do not disappear overnight. The tracks may remain. The wheels may continue falling into them from time to time. But something important changes. The grooves are no longer mistaken for reality itself. The old story becomes visible. The old judgment becomes visible. The old conclusion becomes visible. And once the grooves is seen, another possibility appears. The possibility of looking beyond it. The possibility of meeting. The possibility of allowing the object to speak for itself. Perhaps seeing begins when we notice the tracks we have been following. And perhaps meeting begins when, even for a moment, we are willing to step outside them and look again. Throughout this episode, we have explored a simple idea: meeting. Meeting a rose, a sunrise, a pencil, a thought, an emotion, a human being. Again and again we discovered the same movement. The object appears, then something else appears, a label, a judgment, a memory, a desire, an expectation, and of course, a story. And before we realize it, we are no longer meeting what is in front of us. We are meeting what the mind has added to it. The rose becomes beautiful. The stranger becomes a foreigner. The employee becomes a performer. The spouse becomes an image. The human being becomes a category. The emotion becomes a problem to solve. And the thought becomes a truth to believe. And slowly, the living reality disappears behind our conclusions about it. Yet perhaps seeing begins with a very different movement, not adding, not concluding, not immediately judging, but meeting. Meeting the object before the label, meeting the emotion before the explanation, meeting the human being before we categorize them, meeting the moment before the story. This does not mean becoming naive. It does not mean abandoning intelligence. It does not mean ignoring memory, judgment, inference, or knowledge. All of these have their place. The question is whether they arrive after the meeting or before it. When conclusions arrive first, perception narrows. When meeting comes first, perception remains alive. Perhaps this is why meeting is so important. Without meeting, there can be no deeper seeing. Without meeting, there can be no real understanding. And without meeting, there can be no genuine relationship. A relationship between images is not a relationship. A relationship between labels is not a relationship. And of course, a relationship between stories is not a relationship. Relationship begins when two human beings are actually met. Perhaps this is also where humanity begins, not in agreement, not in ideology, not in belief, but in the simple willingness to encounter another person as a human, a living human, not a role, not a category, not a function, not a stereotype, a human. And perhaps this invitation extends beyond other people to the world itself, to the tree outside the window, to the morning sky, to the thoughts passing through the mind, to the emotions we usually avoid. Perhaps life becomes richer when it is met rather than merely recognized. Perhaps reality becomes clearer when it is encountered rather than interpreted. And perhaps the first step is surprisingly simple. Not to change anything, not to improve anything, not to become anything, but simply to meet the object, to meet the other, to meet ourselves. And in that meeting, perhaps seeing begins. Meeting is a beginning, but meeting alone is not enough. A rose can be met. An emotion can be met, a human being can be met, yet something else is needed if we are to understand what is being encountered. Because even while meeting occurs, the mind continues moving. Thoughts appears, judgments appears, memories appears, desires appears, fears appears, and of course stories begin forming. And often these movements happen so quickly that we hardly notice them. We may meet the object for a moment, then immediately become lost in our reactions to it. This brings us to the next dimension of seeing, awareness. Awareness is the capacity to observe not only the object being met, but also the movements arising within the observer. The rose is seen, and the thought about the rose is seen. The criticism is heard, and the hurt that follows is seen. The human being is met, and the judgments appearing about them are seen. Without awareness, we become absorbed in these movements. With awareness, they become visible. And what becomes visible can begin to be understood. In this episode, we explored meeting, and in the next, we will explore awareness. Because perhaps seeing reality requires not only meeting what appears, but also being aware of everything the mind adds to it. Before we close, I would like to leave you with a simple image. Imagine a soft pillow in the shape of the earth, a soft earth, and imagine yourself holding it gently, hugging it, giving it all the love you can. Because this earth includes all of us, humanity, animals, plants, the environment, everything living together on this small planet. Perhaps from time to time we can return to this image, a soft earth held with care. If you found something meaningful in this episode, please tell others about it. This is first steps to seeing reality, and perhaps the first step is simply to begin noticing. Thank you for listening. Take the chisel away.